All right, tonight we're going to talk about garage doors. I know it's kind of a mundane subject and not all that complicated, but we got some interesting stuff we're going to cover and get into a little detail, perhaps on garage doors that may or may not come into play for home inspecting, but help you understand the mechanics of how doors are put together and how they work and such. And let's see where it takes us from there. Information for this slide program came from these different authorities here. Some of these dates may not be up to date, but they just carry through to the next level. So the garage door is probably the largest component of a house with the capacity to injure or kill somebody. It's a big piece of movable metal. It's imperative that it be evaluated for safety and proper function. I'm sure all of you who do inspecting and have looked at garage doors have had incidences you can convey to everybody about some of the things that have happened to you. I know I got a bunch. So the law specifies the following. You have to have 4 criteria in order for a garage door to work properly. Number 1, all garage door operators must provide a reversing system to reverse a downward moving door within 2 seconds after the door contacts a 2-inch high test block placed on the floor of the door's path. A lot of inspectors carry a little section of 2x4. That's what they use. Some use their flashlights because it's almost equivalent to the same. Whatever works for you and doesn't bog down your tool belt is probably what's going to work for you. So within 2 seconds. Number 2, all garage door operators must reopen the door within 30 seconds of the start of movement in the downward direction if the mechanism senses that the door did not fully close to the garage floor. Criteria number 3, once the door is moving down, the door must stop and may reverse if the control button is pushed again. If the door is moving up, pushing the control button must stop the door and prevent it from moving downward. A lot of doors with some age on them out there do not have some of these criteria attached to them. And I think it's imperative that we point that out to our clients when they're buying a house, so they're at least aware of the consequences of having an old door. Number 4, all garage door operators must have a manually operated means to detach the operator from the door. And that's what they're talking about right there. You pull that cord down and it detaches the operator from the door mechanism. A lot of people use that as a locking device. By engaging the lock, you can't open the door from the outside because the operator is going to hold it closed. Handle on this is usually red or black, and typically it's going to be about 60 inches above the floor. So right about eye level. You want to look for it to make sure it's there when you're inspecting. Doors manufactured after January of 1982 are required to stop upon impact, are required to have a quick release cord on them. Doors manufactured after January of 1993 are required to reverse upon impact, either by using a photocell, a sense edger, an edge sensor, or equivalent, are required to have a quick release cord again, are required to have a sticker. Actually, they have multiple stickers. And we'll talk about what's supposed to be there and what is usually missing. So garage doors have a lot of moving parts. We're going to look at all of them when we're inspecting, and we should, to determine what kind of condition they're in and whether they're operating safely. The attachment of the door and the track to the opening in the garage should look something like this. A minimum of 2x6, typically pressure treated lumber surrounding the opening of the garage door opening. And can be 2x8, but it can't be any less than a 2x6. And that's via the manufacturing specifications. Now the code will allow you to use a 2x4, but the manufacturer says that's a no-no. Spacing of the anchors have to be equally spaced between the top have to be equally spaced between the top of the door and the bottom of the floor. And they should be, the top should be no higher than the header, and the bottom, the first anchor should be 18 to 24 inches off the floor, and they're evenly spaced between those 2 points. If they're too close to the edge of the 2x6, that's not considered proper installation. They should be relatively centered. They don't have to be exactly centered, but they should be relatively centered. And as a matter of fact, the minimum distance from the edge should be anywhere from 2.5 inches, either left or right, and up to 4.5 inches if you're using larger lumber. Door frame anchors, minimum embedded depends on whether it is a C90 or a wood frame wall. Generally, excuse me, 1.5 inch minimum embed was the norm for most name brand self-tapping anchors from the edge, with 2.5 inches from the edge. Minimum embed for wood frame, 1 3/4 to 2 inches with a 7/8 inch outside diameter washer, depending on species of lumber. And that's dictated by Simpson Strong Tie.
So, Mike, let me interrupt here for a minute. I think you said, but you've used the term "the law requires." Can you elaborate on that phrase? The law requires.
Well, by the law, I mean the DASMA folks. When you look in the code book, it references. It doesn't specifically say in the code book, but it does reference other authorities. It references DASMA and the Consumer Product Safety Commission type requirements, and that's where I'm using the term law.
All right, so we've got another question here, and it's the set, and you already know what it is. It's the one about testing the garage door and accidentally damaging the door.
And what about it?
Damaging the door, but your test, doing the test that and ends up damaging the door.
And you're asking me what to do about it?
Well, I just make sure you address that at some point. I know that in my experience, that if I do what the garage door manufacturers recommend, which is to run it down on a 2x4, I have never damaged a door doing that, and I've done probably 10,000 garage doors that way and never damaged a one. I damaged them before when I did what I was trained to do in the past, holding it, stopping it when it was only halfway down and stupid stuff like that. But if you do what the manufacturers recommend, I've never damaged one, but maybe your experience is different.
Well, with the older doors, they didn't have this mechanism that I'm going to talk about later on in the presentation. I'll show you what it looks like. It absorbs that kind of shock, but in the older doors, they didn't have it, and consequently, digging or bending the upper panel of the door was more common, but not so much with newer doors. A lot of those old doors have gone by the wayside, hopefully, and the new stuff is working better. So about anchor spacing. Anchor spacing depends on how much resistive force is called for. That's going to be determined by the market area you're inspecting in. Different market areas are going to have different requirements for damage or storm damage resistance. In Florida, for example, we have the highest degree of resistance. So consequently, our anchors have to be very specifically placed and properly spaced. For example, a 9-foot garage door resisting 10 pounds per square foot of wind pressure, anchor spacing will be 24 inches, and so forth all the way down the line. The larger the door and the greater the resistance, the closer together the anchors are going to be. And that's just determined by your local jurisdiction. Anchors are to be evenly spaced between the header and the floor, as I mentioned a minute ago. The first bottom anchor starting at no more than half the maximum on-center distance. Highest anchor installed at least as high as the door opening, the header in other words. Door frame should be a minimum of 2x6 structural grade lumber. Use washers provided by the anchor manufacturer. Look for those washers. Sometimes they're not put in because they're a separate entity, and they should be there. If it's missing, that weakens the door frame. Special requirements for garage doors with center post systems. You want to follow the manufacturing specifications on those. In Florida, they don't allow those as well. You can use them, but they don't meet the wind resistant criteria. So you don't see a lot of them here. Supporting structure.
Mike, excuse me. I've got a question here. about I think you were saying washers. Those are the washers on the bolt that holds the 2x6 frame to the structure, or that's in the door hardware. Which one are you?
The washer goes under the nut that holds the frame around the perimeter of the door opening.
That 2x6.
The 2x6, yes.
Okay, good.
Supporting structural elements should be designed by a registered professional engineer. That's if you decide to go off reservation on what the requirements are, then an engineer can design something specific for that particular house, and it'll be approved if the engineer puts a stamp on it. You don't run across that very much because of the expense. Most expansive type anchors do not do well in engineering. We're talking redheads. A lot of you have been around for a while. You know what redheads are. They were used pretty extensively 20, 30 years ago. Not so much anymore, and they are not allowed to be embedded in the 2x6 around a garage door opening. Mostly what we see is L boats. They're 1/2 inch by 8 inches usually, with a 1 5/8 outside diameter washer placed 2 3/4 from the edge of the 2x6. If it's 2 inches, that's not a big deal. It's when it's a 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch, 1 inch off the edge, then it becomes a serious issue because it weakens the 2x6 ability to do its job. So, these numbers are referenced only, in my opinion. I know they're specifically stated here, but I don't make a big deal if it's 2.5 inches instead of 2 3/4. You got to use a little common sense. Missing nut, missing washer. No good. What's equivalent to what's an equivalent sensor? A non-contact sensing edge, an invisible field sensing device generated in and around the bottom of the door that senses any conductive object and causes the door to reverse upon contact when contact is made. Is this an equivalent sensor? Anybody think this is an equivalent sensor? It isn't. It's there for security. Somebody opens the door inadvertently and they're not supposed to, an alarm goes off in the house telling you the door's been opened by somebody. So it's a security device. Don't confuse the two. Security sensors. These are mounted above the door instead of on the floor, but they serve the same purpose. Typical stickers are required to be mounted adjacent to the door and adjacent to the control button at the inner door, at the inner passage walk-through door. Now, these are going to be missing all the time. Either they were there at one time and they got worn off or not put on at all, or something happened to them where they're not showing up anymore. There are things you can do to replace them. They're available for replacement. Nobody ever does that. I do not make a big deal out of it in a single family home. It was a condo with a commercial parking area. I would be more stringent about it, but that's your call. Excuse me. And this is what the other one says. Conduct these tests at least once a month. Do you know anybody who tests their garage door once a month? Nobody ever does that. It's probably going to be the home inspector when he's doing the inspection, which could be on a house that's 5, 10, 20 years old. Never been tested. We're the ones that are doing it the day we're there. So be careful because you have no idea how it's going to react. What's proper placement of the sensor? Manufacturers recommends 4 to 8 inches. Building code recommends 6 inches. I would go with the manufacturing specs because they have more command of their product than the code does. But anywhere from 4 to 8 inches is fine. So 36 inches, does that work? No. The reason I put the homeowner's picture in here is because he was very proud of his installation. He did it himself. "24 inches off the floor. Proper installation." No. 2 inches away from the track. Proper installation. No. This is hard to see, but on the right side of the track, where the track is, the sensor is about 3 or 4 inches off the floor. And on the left side, it's, here's a better view. It's 14 inches off the floor. That's not going to work. You can tell if the receiver and the transmitter are properly aligned, because a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them have little LED lights installed in them. And when the light's green, that means they're sensing each other. And when it's not green, it might be yellow, it might be red, that means they're out of alignment. And that's easy to spot when you're doing your inspection. Mounting them on the ceiling is very, very commonly done. I have no idea why. Actually, I do know why. It's because the door opener won't work unless the photocells are in place and they sense each other. So people mount them up there in order to get them out of the way. That's not a good idea.
That's a real bad idea.
Very, very much so. I think they do it without realizing what the ramifications of what they're doing is. And I try to explain it to them, but you can't force them to do what they won't want to do. But if you make them aware of it, you've done your job.
You know, Mike, I have that experience that when I talk to people about safety issues, that if they have a story to tell, they have some memory, it triggers that memory and they tell me the story. Oh yeah, I remember when. I've had two people now tell me that they have firsthand knowledge of somebody being killed by a garage door.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I was going to eliminate telling you some news articles that came out where children got killed, but I thought it might be too blatant to do in a nice evening like this. But yeah, it happens pretty regularly, usually with kids, because they don't know any better. And you don't want to be the recipient of that because you neglected to tell the home buyers what they needed to know. I mean, I've got dozens of pictures of these kinds of installations that I've collected over the years, so it's really common for it to happen.
It's foolishness.
This is no way to test either. Neither is this. And this is what the sensor should be sensing: an object that's breaking the beam, causing the door to stop and or reverse if it's a newer door. There are different types of remotes out there. They need to be placed in a point in the garage where you cannot reach them and be adjacent to the door at the same time. Usually found by the inner door that leads into the house, and that's required to be 6 inches above the finished floor. What a lot of people don't realize is 60 inches is fine as long as there's no step up or stoop where the inner house door is for somebody to stand on and be able to reach the remote. The point of the 60 inches is to keep it out of reach of children. So make sure if there is a stoop or a step up into the house, the remote is far enough away so a child cannot be standing on that stoop and reach the remote. I do a lot of new construction monitoring, and that gets violated all the time in brand new houses. There's our entrapment warning label. It should be there. Find it, don't find it, decide what you want to do about it. Good example of a stoop right here. It's actually only 50 inches above the floor, or above the stoop, not 50 inches above the floor. This is a brand new house, 53 inches above the light switch. The contractor should have known better. So a little bit about the mechanics of doors. I know this is not something we usually get involved in, but it's interesting stuff. The raised groove helps distribute the tension on the drum notch and cable nub. So you catch your cable in that little notch right there, and you wrap it around the drum, tighten it up, and that creates the tension for the springs to balance the door or have it go up and down without much effort. There are two types of springs out there, as you may know. We have expansion springs and we have torsion springs. Expansion springs are usually on the left and right side of the door, whereas the torsion springs are usually mounted above the door where the header is. There are pros and cons about each. A lot of door manufacturers are leaning towards using torsion springs more and more, even though they cost more, because they're safer. Here's an example of one. You can see where the spring is broken. So that's something you're going to write up when you're inspecting. Needs to be replaced. The door is no longer balanced because that spring is not functioning as it's designed to do.
Mike, when you say the torsion springs are safer, they're a whole lot more dangerous to work on.
Why do you say that, Hollis?
Well, I've got once again, I've got two friends who broke their arms trying to adjust their garage door with those torsion springs.
Oh, I grant you that the energy that's capsulated in the torsion spring is pretty hefty, no doubt about it. A lot more than the expansion spring is. You're right on that.
You have to know what you're doing.
Exactly.
Hollis, I think you need to find yourself some new friends.
When you see this sort of thing, you want to call it out because it's getting ready to pop. It's getting ready to break. And with expansion springs, once it breaks, the tension in that spring now is going to want to fly around the room in order to release all that energy. And if the home inspector is standing there when that happens, he's liable to get it in the head, and that's not a good thing.
And there's no cable. There's no cable.
Yes, you're right. No cable. But we have one here. And that's the requirement now in newer doors. Have the expansion spring controlled or tethered in some way so that it doesn't fly around the room and take a home inspector's head off. So look for that. You might be looking at a door that is prior to that requirement, in which case you can't fault the door for that. You might want to recommend they put one in, however, unless the door is so bad that they're going to replace it anyway. But it can't hurt to do a recommendation just to be on the safe side. Whether they do it or not is up to them at that point. Another example of a tethered expansion spring. The nice thing about torsion springs is that when they break, the rod in the middle of them holds them in place so they can't fly around. On the other hand, the upper right picture showing the expansion spring, you can see where the cable's coming through there. But that spring is getting ready to break. You can see where it's overstretched right at the end. So if and when it ever goes, that cable is going to hold it in place and not allow it to fly around the garage. Here's one where it's missing, both of them. Now, these doors may predate the requirement, so you can't really, I wouldn't go so far as to call it a defect, but a recommendation that one be put in and explain why. Torsion springs were invented for three reasons. They stay in place when broken. They keep the door balanced with even tension. The door operates smoother. And Crawford Door was the first company to advertise them in 1976. And other manufacturers have been taking that suggestion along with their products as well. Springs are color coded. I know this really doesn't come into play with home inspecting, but it's interesting to know. You notice that these colors are all the same in all three categories, but the amount of tension they're able to handle varies as much as 100 pounds per category. So if you're looking at a 20-foot door, it's probably not going to fit in the 60-pound category. It's probably going to be in the higher category. So you notice the color of the springs. They usually got color at the ends with little paint or whatever they use. And common sense puts it in the category that's best suited for that door. 9-foot door, not so much. Springs are also paired. So if you see an old spring and a new spring on the same door, that's a bad installation because they need to be replaced uniformly. If one's bad, you replace them both because they're paired for that reason. Glazing. Well, the old doors, if they had windows in them, they were probably just single pane plate glass, but not so much anymore. Now if they're going to have windows in them, they're going to have to meet some kind of wind resistant criteria. And it's either going to be impact rated window panes in there, or it's going to be Lexan or some kind of product that will resist wind as well as a impact rated panel will. Injuries, pinch, crush, section, joints, a lot of them every year. Failing doors, falling doors. I've had doors fall on my head more times than I want to remember.
Well, you know, it's a problem there, Mike, is when people operate the safety release when the door is open.
Yeah. Whenever I have the opportunity, I ask my client if they're there, because they're always looking for something to do anyway. I will ask them to go operate the door for me. It's kind of a cop-out, I know, but it gets me off the hook. And if the homeowner's there, I'll do the same thing with them. I'll say, would you operate that door for me? I could watch you do it. And if anything happens, I didn't touch it. Sharp edges, glass, broken glass, especially indoors. You don't see a lot of glass anymore. And if it's going to be impact rated glass, it's not going to be sharp edged. Springs are the most common defect on the door. They wear out because they're moving all the time. Broken door, the panels can be broken. Other types of entrapment, fingers caught where they shouldn't be, for examples, usually with children, sometimes with adults. Race to beat the door, that's definitely a child thing. And riding the door, that's definitely a child thing as well. They don't realize what they're doing. Here we go.
Hey, look where their fingers are.
This is an anti-pinch hinge type hinge. You can't get your fingers caught in these. A lot of the newer doors are using this technology now. And that's what the anti-pinch hinge looks like. Different design door pressures, depending on what part of the country you're living in and where you're inspecting. We are in the 140, 150 mile an hour range where I live. So you're going to see a pretty heavy duty reinforced door if it meets these criteria. Matter of fact, I got some examples I'll show you in a minute. How are they tested? 10-second at design pressure. And it's not only positive pressure, it's not only wind blowing against the door, it's wind sucking the door off its hinges. So it's positive and negative pressure it has to be. And 10-second at 1.5 times the design pressure, positive and negative. This is a lot of gobbledygook you're really not going to be interested in, so I'm going to skip over it. Just technical stuff about how they do, how they test doors. Wind load guides are based on exposures B, C, or D. Exposure B, urban and suburban areas, wooded areas, or other terrain with numerous closely spaced obstructions having the size of single-family dwellings or larger. Exposure C, open terrain with scattered obstructions having heights generally less than 30 feet. And exposure D, flat, unobstructed areas exposed to wind flowing over large bodies of water, like the Atlantic Ocean, for example. There are different kinds of rollers out there. Most doors, if they're low-end doors especially, are going to have steel rollers in them. Steel rollers have 7 ball bearings in the roller. So they tend to be pretty noisy, and they wear out quickly. By that, I mean, after 7, 8, 10 years. There are polymer rollers. Polymer rollers don't have any bearings in them because that's a solid disc of polymer. And they seem to be they run very quietly for that reason, because they're not stiff like steel is, and they have a little give to them. And nylon rollers have 11 ball bearings in them, and they're a lot quieter. So if you have a client that's complaining about a noisy door, you might suggest they change the rollers from steel into nylon or maybe polymer. That's going to quiet the door down quite a bit. Operators, most are adjustable. We don't do that, but be aware that's how they make the door run more smoothly. And they have a manufacturing date on them. And that'll tell you the age of the operator and maybe the age of the door itself, if you don't know. Look for that date. Condominiums might have multiple garage doors. You have to decide whether you want to look at all of them or just one. There are 2 types of radii, track radii doors. There's 12-inch radii and a 15-inch radii. And then the type of radii used are going to depend on the clearance between the top header of the door and the ceiling. If you got a really low ceiling, they're probably going to go with a 12-inch radii. Very commonly done with normal ceiling height is 15-inch. Storm resistant doors. Notice that the track brackets are they're more multiple track brackets. Instead of the typical 3 you might see on a track, which is the minimal number, you'll have anywhere from 5 to 7 to more brackets securing it to the 2x6. And also the metal itself is going to be a heavier gauge. The track is going to be a heavier gauge, and the bracket's going to be a heavier gauge. And the door is going to have horizontal bars across it that are pretty heavy duty. And these types of doors can handle up to 150 miles an hour of storm wind, both positively and negatively. There's another example of one. This is what's called a hurricane impact door. And we see them everywhere down here because of hurricanes. And it gives you an insurance discount if you put these in. Basic rated, you notice the horizontal bars are pretty minimal, and there's glass in the door, which is going to minimize the amount of impact it can handle. Homemade door. This is wood. It's actually probably stronger than some of the metal doors that are out there, but it's not recognized as a viable alternative. Same thing with these. No longer legal and don't meet any criteria. By that, I mean, you don't have to take them out, but you're not going to get any insurance rating on these. And eventually they're going to rot. You can see the bottom of the door here, the big door. It's all starting to rot at the bottom where it's in contact with the concrete. So it's only a matter of time before they're going to have to replace it. Possible incomes when inspecting. We see these all the time. You got to be careful because you do it, you own it. Rollers jumping the track. That's what causes this to happen. And the door is out of balance. This is what I was talking about when Hollis brought up that one question. This is a spring-loaded attachment that goes right at the top panel of the door and attaches to the chain link of the operator. What happens when you close and open that door, that spring in there absorbs some of that potential energy that's created. So it doesn't damage the panel itself. it absorbs that energy. A lot of the older doors didn't have that, and consequently that top panel would absorb that energy and bend. But with this, that's eliminated extensively. So you might want to look for that before you operate the door. Commercial and residential operators, it used to be a no-no to see these in residential applications, but they're starting to make headway into multiple unit condominium units, things like that, where you don't have a lot of ceiling space between the header and the ceiling. So you mount a side mounted, what they call a commercial application with a chain link. And that's what operates, opens and closes the door. Most commercial door operators have a much larger motor in them, where typically a residential garage door operator will run on half a horsepower. These are going to run on 3/4 to 1 horsepower. And a lot of them are going to require more than 120 volts to operate on. They're going to require 240 or more. So, but the application is starting to work its way into residential applications. So they are making what we call commercial operators now that actually are being used residentially and are equipped to be used residentially.
So there's no chain guard on that, huh?
Sorry?
There's no chain guard.
No, there is not.
Yeah.
And it's not required. According to the manufacturer, it's not required.
Yeah.
And they have dates on them, so you know how old they are. This is 2001. They don't have a quick release, and they don't have a door sensor. That has to be installed separately. Different commercial applications. And different remotes. Unlike the typical remote you would see with a residential application, these are more industrialized. Some of them don't even have stop buttons. They just have an open and close button, which is kind of dangerous. This is a fingerprint recognition door lock, garage door lock. You put your thumb on there and it'll recognize it or not and open and close the door. Kind of cool. These are the different companies. If you want to find out more manufacturing specifics on them, they all have their own way. They're basically all the same, but they have minor differences in them. And you get on the website, you get on Google, and you Google these companies, and you can download their specifications for free usually, and that'll tell you what you need to know about a specific door. Garage doors are getting fancy. As a matter of fact, I was doing an inspection a few years ago, backing into a driveway, and I happened to hit one of these fancy door panels with my car, not realizing I was going too far in. And to replace one panel of a 4-panel door, it was a real fancy panel, $1,500.
Ouch.
Well, my insurance covered it, but I was unbelievable because $1,500 on a common regular door, you can buy a whole door for that, plus the installation. But now that was the cost of the one panel. So be careful. The fancier they are, the more expensive they are. Some of them are very pretty. These are garage doors.
I hope nobody tries to walk in there.
Can you imagine coming home drunk one night and not realizing the door's closed? This is a Christmas one. This is a this is a garage door where the whole back of the porch opens, and the garage, the parking is underneath. This is an elevated house.
Where was that?
I found this online.
Uh,
Thought it was interesting. 10 common issues. Make a checklist, check these out, and you'll be covered pretty well. Opening and closing issues. It doesn't want to open and close smoothly. The sensors are blocked. Broken springs. Some of these are pretty obvious. Cranky rollers. They're noisy, in other words. Or they jitter when you open the door. The opener won't work. Unusual noises coming from the door or the operator. Uneven door. Slow opening. Transmitter issues. Keypad not synced. Opening and closing, they're out of balance. It's a balance issue. Door needs to be serviced. Block sensors, realign the sensors. Broken springs, replace the springs. Cranky rollers, they're worn out, replace them. Dying opener, is it over 20 years old? Probably just worn out from tiredness and you need to get a new one. Unusual noises, bad rollers, loose parts, creaking, sloppy chain, or too much slack in the chain, if that's what they're using. Those are all indicative of unusual noises. Uneven door. The door needs alignment, needs to be realigned. This all happens, by the way, with regular servicing of the door, which people do not do. The door should be, garage doors should be serviced annually. They need to be lubricated. They need to be cleaned. Worn out parts need to be replaced. Nobody ever does that. They wait until the door falls apart and then they buy a new one. But we can help them along that line by noticing these things and suggesting what they need to do about it. The door opens slowly. Door needs to be serviced. Transmitter issues. Replace the batteries. Keypad not synced. Reinstall the code. It'll sync up. Pretty easy stuff. So wrap up, we want to check the garage door frame for proper attachment, check for proper size bolts and spacing, check physical condition of the door, any dents, dings, scrapes, alignment, rollers, springs, check physical condition of the springs, also any cable restraints, check proper operation, safety protocols come into play there. Be thorough. Seems like we're going to spend more time in the garage door than we are in the whole house. Questions? We got time for questions.
yeah. So, Mike, I just you started out by talking about the safety issues, and I think that's important. And then you showed some damaged doors, doors that appeared to have been damaged, maybe while you were inspecting them, perhaps. And then Nick had a question about that. I mean, I'm not afraid to test a garage door if I've already looked at it very carefully. I did an inspection a number of years ago for a friend's daughter was buying a house, and he asked me to inspect it for her. And I got to the garage door, and before I touched anything, I just looked at it, and the rollers were just barely. You could just see the rollers were the track wasn't properly aligned. So I imagined that as the door opened, it was very likely that the rollers were going to come out of the track. Right. So I refused to test it. I just told the people, look, this is not properly installed. I'm not going to operate it. Get the garage door guy out here to fix it. And the real estate agent, and for this particular type, the agent is saying, there's nothing wrong with that door. So he pushed the button, the door opened. He said, look, there's nothing wrong with that door. He pushed the button, it closed. I still didn't. I walked away.
Okay.
Okay. Well, 3 weeks later, I got a text message from my friend whose daughter, was his daughter buying the house. He says, "Good call on the garage door," and he sends me a picture similar to those pictures you showed of the doors damaged and off the track and falling out of the opening.
Yeah.
He said the next time somebody tried to open the door after that agent did that, it fell off the track.
I believe it. It happens pretty easy. That's why what you said makes a lot of sense. You want to look very closely at everything before you actually operate the door to see if there's any red flags about something that might happen when you push that button. Very much so. Yeah, so be careful out there, guys, because it's easy to take a door that looks great and push that button and it collapses in your face.
So, Mike, that same question is coming up. This is the most common question that I hear about about testing garage doors. So I'm going to read it word for word here. I know a lot of inspectors who do not who do not use an obstruction 2x4 to test because they have damaged doors doing that. Do you have any advice about that?
Well, you got to use your best judgment. If you decide that it's going to be too dangerous, or just as a general principle, you don't want to check garage doors because of the potential that might happen, that's a business decision you can make, and that's fine. Make sure it's in your report, make sure it's in your agreement so they understand that you're not going to test that door and for the reasons specified. I like to push the envelope in a little bit, and sometimes I get in trouble doing it, but that's just me. I've had doors fall on my head. I've had doors fall down out of the track. I remember one example where it happened to be a vacant house. The real estate agent was there. The buyer was there. I pushed the garage door button. The whole thing came down on my head. And the top two panels were just curled right over in the garage.
Yeah.
Fortunately, it was a bank-owned house. I had blood all over my face. I went into the house trying to wash my face off. My face was all red from the blood coming out of my scalp. The real estate agent fainted. She fainted. The home buyer was in shock. I cleaned myself up. I finished the report. I called my son. Fortunately, it was close to where I live. I called my son, told him to come over. We need to wire this door back in place because we couldn't leave the house, open. You learn lessons from doing that stuff,
So Jim Vaughn is reminding us that in Virginia, this is specific to Virginia, but a lot of us are from Virginia, that you're not required to do that test. You're running it down on the 2x4 because of that. So Virginia specifically says you don't have to do that.
I agree. I think it's a good policy, but you're opening yourself up to why didn't you do it? And now the door is not working. And why didn't you look at it? We hired you to inspect the house. I mean, you get arguments like that for people who are looking to blame somebody because they're going to pay for something they didn't want to pay for.
So Virginia does require that you do test a reverse feature. So if I check the safety sensors, the eyes, and that reverses the door, I'm okay. And I do tell people that there is another test that is that the manufacturer has to check the door. I used to use my hand to stop the doors. It was coming down, but everything's at the wrong angle. Stuff isn't right for that door to stop there. So you should never use a hand or an arm to check the door when it's coming down. If you want to check for reverse, put a 2x4 down.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. I use my flashlight. My flashlight's 1.5 inches in diameter.
Jim, you're absolutely correct with that. Why would you put yourself in any danger? I had a fiberglass door over in Tyson's Corner one day, and the thing was so thin you could almost put your hand through it. And why would you try to put that 2x4 down? Because if you break it, it's never gonna. Yeah, you're gonna have to pay for the door. So that's crazy.
This one company, Clopay, used to make these really cheap garage doors. They would crumple in a heartbeat. I was at a brand new townhouse, went over there, pushed the button, had the door coming down, walked over there, grabbed it with my hand, and the top panel on that door immediately crumpled up. Immediately. It was at that point that I figured out this is not a good idea.
So I have always made a point to disconnect the door from the opener and make sure open the door and make sure that at approximately 2.5 feet that door stays open. If it falls shut, there's too much, it does not have enough pressure, that is tension on the springs, and it needs to be adjusted. How many of you check the door in that manner?
Well, it's one of the things we should be doing. The door should be balanced one of the first things you should do with a garage door is check the balance by disconnecting the operator. If it's out of balance, everything else is going to be screwed. How do you think they get away with using half a horsepower on the operator on a 20-foot door? It's because it's in balance. The operator is not lifting or lowering the door. It's not carrying that load. It's only opening and closing the door.
Right, right.
So another thing I don't think we've talked about is if the receptacle is so far away from the garage door operator that you need an extension cord.
Illegal to do that. You can't use extension cord under any circumstances as permanent wiring.
So there's talk about the pressure, the amount of pressure that the door will apply to the 2x4. If you running it down on a 2x4, that's what the manufacturers recommend. That's the test that they recommend. But what about testing for pressure, for how much pressure there is?
They actually make a tool where you can do that. I don't know if very many home inspectors have it. I don't, but I know it exists. You can buy a pressure tool. I don't know what it's called specifically, that where you put under the door like a 2x4, and it'll tell you what kind of pressure is exerted when that door closes.
The insurance industry also specifies a 2x4. The brochure that comes with all garage door openers was written by the insurance industry, and they specify a 2x4.
Yeah, so there's a lot of arguments in favor of putting the 2x4 down there, and a lot of arguments against it, and they're all good arguments.
Yeah, if I have any questions about whether it's going to, if I'm going to do the 2x4, either I'm going to do the 2x4 or I'm not going to test the door at all because there's something else. I'm going to disclaim it and write down lots of things about it. But if I'm going to test the door, I'm going to test it the way the manufacturer says to.
Makes sense.
I'm with you on that. So what about
Mike? Who's responsible for getting an extension on the cable to plug it in if you can't use an extension cord? Is that up to the installer?
Well,
you talk about the extension. Go ahead, Hollis. Go ahead.
Yeah,
I was going to say somebody has to install a receptacle that's close enough for the cord to reach. So if the installer is not an electrician, somebody needs to call an electrician, right? Does that answer your question?
Installer
sort of, but some
the
of
door.
some of these doors are really, really high off the, from the ceiling. They're not really close to a ceiling. Some of these huger homes, have like a 20-foot ceiling in the garage.
So someone would have to extend something down that would support a receptacle and fasten the receptacle to it, right? I mean, does that make sense?
You're absolutely right.
Either that or extend the cord out of the motor.
You can't. It's like a wall air conditioner. You can't put an extension cord on it. You can't put an extension cord on a garage door operator. It has to be directly plugged in.
That's correct.
Yeah, but he's suggesting that you replace the cord with a longer cord from the motor. Actually, open the motor up and replace the cord. I don't know if that's.
I'm not sure that's kosher either.
Yeah.
Also, that receptacle has to be ground fault protected and
dedicated.
But available to reset at an accessible place. So that receptacle should be able to be reset at garage floor level. Do you agree with that?
I don't.
Well, that's the way it's going to be. What they're going to do.
You can't plug your garage door operator on a GFCI receptacle, because if it trips, you can't open the door.
Why can't you reset? Why can't you reset it on the garage, like just on the garage floor area? 5 feet above the garage floor. That should be
where the.
Jim Vaughn, can you chime in on this, please?
Yeah, you can put an outlet up as high as you want or need and put a blank face GFI right on the wall that controls that outlet. What's the problem here?
The problem is when you come home after a hard day's work, you push your garage door button and it doesn't open because the GFCI is stripped. I seem to remember something in the NEC where they said that's not required. You have that there. It's not required.
In Virginia, you have to have a GFI for all garage receptacles, including the one for the door. And if it's 30 feet up in the air, you can put a blank face GFI on the wall. But you have to have GFI for all garage receptacles. I don't know if that's in the NEC, the RSC, or what. It's somewhere. I don't think Virginia added it.
Is that true of the freezer as well?
Jim,
Yes,
you are correct with that. And yes, if you have a garage refrigerator, that should be on a GFCI.
Yes.
In Maryland now, they require everything to have a GFCI. You're kind of screwed. The sump pump, the refrigerator, the door opener, everything's on a GFCI.
Yeah, bad idea.
Well, the refrigerator circuit should be a separate circuit.
It is.
What I'm seeing with these refrigerator circuits is GFCIs with alarms built into them. So that if that GFCI does trip, it has a little alarm. I've seen a bunch of those.
Yeah, you usually see those for freezers, refrigerators, or sump pumps or ejector pumps.
Correct.
All right, let's get the code out so we can be done, please. Thank you very much.
A lot of garage door manufacturers also require an emergency key access so that you can grab the pull, the emergency release from outside in case you do have a power situation.
So, one thing we haven't touched on is or maybe I missed it, was be sure you unlock the manual lock before you push the button, and that manual lock should be disabled.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Make sure the door's not locked before you try to open it.
I've seen plenty of garage door torn up on a foreclosure where they've bolted those shut and somebody comes in and pushes the button and damages the panel.
Yeah.